The American Revolution, the shot that changed history. On a quiet April morning, as the sun began to burn the mist off a small village green, 77 colonial farmers stood in a loose formation, clutching their muskets. These weren't professional soldiers. They were blacksmiths, tanners, and shoemakers, and they were staring down 700 soldiers from the most powerful army in the world. They were ordered to disperse, but they held their ground. Then, a single shot from an unknown gun shattered the silence, and in that instant, a rebellion became a revolution. This is the story of how a 10-year dispute over taxes and liberty finally exploded into war. This is the story of the shot heard round the world. The powder keg. The year was 1775, and the American colonies, especially Massachusetts, were a powder keg just waiting for a spark. For more than a decade, tensions with Great Britain had been climbing. It didn't start with bullets, but with paper and taxes. The Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts. To the colonists, these were more than just economic policies. They felt like an assault on their fundamental rights. They were being taxed by a parliament thousands of miles away where they had no voice. That cry of no taxation without representation wasn't just a catchy slogan. It was the heart of a deep and growing divide. Then the soldiers arrived. The British government, seeing the unrest in Boston as a dangerous defiance, sent troops to enforce its authority. The presence of redcoats in the city was a constant source of friction, a daily reminder of the Crown's power. In 1770, that friction ignited into the Boston Massacre, where British soldiers fired into a crowd of colonists. Propagandists like Paul Revere quickly spread sensationalized engravings of the event, fueling anti-British anger throughout the colonies. The final straw was a series of punitive laws passed in 1774, which the colonists called the Intolerable Acts. These were a direct response to the Boston Tea Party. The port of Boston was closed, the Massachusetts government was essentially dissolved, and the city was placed under the military authority of General Thomas Gage, the new royal governor. Gage's mission was simple: stamp out the rebellion before it could really start. By April 1775, Gage was convinced that the key to avoiding war was to disarm the colonists. His spies reported a large stash of weapons, ammunition, and even cannons was being stockpiled by the colonial militia in Concord, a small town about 20 miles from Boston. The plan was simple: a secret, swift night march to seize and destroy those supplies. Gage hoped that by taking away their ability to fight, he could end the conflict before it began. Instead, his actions lit the fuse. The Midnight Ride. The British thought their plan was a secret, but they seriously underestimated the colonists. Boston was crawling with Patriot spies, a network of artisans and laborers with the silversmith Paul Revere at its center. On the evening of April 18, 1775, Dr. Joseph Warren, a key Patriot leader, got wind of the British plan. He had to get a warning to Samuel Adams and John Hancock, two other Patriot leaders who were staying in Lexington, right on the road to Concord. Warren sent for two riders, Paul Revere and William Dawes. They took different routes to make sure the message got through. Revere had also set up a backup signal from the steeple of the Old North Church. One lantern if the British were marching by land, two if they were crossing the Charles River by boat. As Revere got ready to leave, lantern flickered in the darkness. The alarm was already spreading before he even set foot on the other side. The story most of us know, thanks to Longfellow's famous poem, is of a lone hero shouting, "The British are coming." But the reality was more complex and, honestly, even more impressive. Revere never shouted that famous line. After all, the colonists still saw themselves as British. The warning was the regulars are coming out, and he was far from alone. Revere and Dawes were just the first links in a sophisticated chain of riders and alarms, designed to call up the militia from dozens of nearby towns. It was a massive, coordinated effort by ordinary citizens. Revere rode hard through the night, dodging British patrols. He got to Lexington around midnight and gave his urgent warning to Hancock and Adams. Dawes arrived a little later, having taken a longer path. They decided to push on to Concord to make sure the weapons were safe, and they were joined by a young doctor, Samuel Prescott. It was a lucky meeting. Just outside Lincoln, a British patrol ambushed them. Revere was captured, and Dawes was forced to flee on foot. But Samuel Prescott escaped into the woods and successfully carried the warning all the way to Concord. The alarm was out. Across the countryside, church bells rang and signal guns fired, calling the Minutemen, named for their promise to be ready to fight at a minute's notice, to action. The standoff at Lexington. As dawn broke on April 19th, Captain John Parker and about 77 men from the Lexington militia gathered on the town green. These were farmers and tradesmen, badly outnumbered and outmatched. Parker, a veteran of the French and Indian War, knew that a direct fight with 700 British regulars was suicide. His men weren't blocking the road to Concord. They were making a clear political statement. He reportedly told his men, "Stand your ground. Don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have a war, let it begin here." Soon the front of the British column, led by Major John Pitcairn, marched into view. The sight of armed militia on the green was an unexpected challenge. British light infantry, in a moment of confusion, rushed onto the common, trying to surround the colonists and disarm them. Major Pitcairn galloped ahead, shouting for the militia to lay down their arms and leave. Captain Parker, seeing his small company about to be swarmed, ordered his men to disperse. But in the noise and confusion, with officers shouting orders and men on both sides on edge, the moment was balanced on a knife's edge. And then it happened. A single gunshot rang out. To this day, no one knows for sure who fired it. Some British soldiers claimed a colonist shot from behind a hedge. Some colonists swore they saw a British officer fire his pistol first. Many on both sides said they simply didn't know. That mystery is part of what makes the event so powerful. It was a spontaneous, anonymous act that unleashed a decade of pent-up anger. That one shot, whoever fired it, broke the spell. The British regulars, acting without orders, unleashed a ragged but deadly volley into the backs of the dispersing militiamen. It wasn't a battle, it was a slaughter. When the smoke cleared, 8 Lexington men were dead and 10 more were wounded. The British had only 1 soldier wounded. The Redcoats gave a victory cheer, fired another volley, and marched on to Concord, leaving behind a grieving town and a blood-soaked field. The war had begun. The climax at Concord's North Bridge. While the British were delayed at Lexington, the alarm had spread like wildfire. By the time the regulars marched into Concord, hundreds of militiamen from Concord, Lincoln, and nearby towns had already gathered. Thanks to the early warning, the colonists had managed to move and hide most of the military supplies. The British commander, Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith, sent companies to search the town and secure key points, including the North Bridge over the Concord River. About 400 militiamen led by Colonel James Barrett gathered on a hill overlooking the bridge, watching as about 100 British soldiers stood guard. From their vantage point, the colonists saw smoke rising from the center of town. They were terrified the British were burning their homes. In reality, the Redcoats had found and set fire to a few leftover supplies, like wooden gun carriages. But for the colonists, that smoke was the final provocation. The colonial officers made a decision. They would march down to the bridge and confront the British. As the column of 400 militiamen advanced, the British soldiers, now outnumbered 4 to 1, fell back across the bridge. Then, a shot rang out. Another disputed first shot, possibly a warning shot that hit the river. It was followed by a volley from the British regulars. This time, the shots found their mark, killing Captain Isaac Davis and Abner Hosmer, 2 Minutemen from the town of Acton. Major John Buttrick of Concord, leading the advance, turned to his men and yelled what became the first official command to open fire in the American Revolution. "Fire, fellow soldiers! For God's sake, fire!" A volley of colonial musketry erupted. For the first time, American colonists, acting under orders, fired on the King's troops. The British, shocked by the disciplined fire, took heavy losses. 3 soldiers were killed and several more were wounded. Stunned and outnumbered, the Redcoats broke ranks and fled in a panic back toward the main force. The embattled farmers had stood their ground and won. This moment, even more than the skirmish at Lexington, is what Ralph Waldo Emerson would later call the place where colonists fired the shot heard round the world. It was the first time the militia forced the professional army to retreat. proving they could and would fight back. A bloody retreat. The British success at Lexington and Concord was quickly becoming irrelevant. Lieutenant Colonel Smith realized his position was a disaster. The colonial militia was growing by the minute, and his troops were deep in enemy territory. He gave the order to retreat to Boston. What followed wasn't a march, but a brutal 18-mile running battle. The alarm system that Revere and others had set in motion was now paying off spectacularly. Thousands of militiamen from more than 24 towns swarmed the battle road. They didn't fight in neat lines like European armies. They used the landscape, firing from behind stone walls, trees, and houses in a relentless guerrilla-style attack. For the British soldiers, the retreat was a nightmare. Marching in tight columns, they were perfect targets for an enemy they could barely see. The colonists, whom they had dismissed as farmers, were now a deadly, invisible force. The fighting was furious and chaotic. The redcoats, exhausted and taking casualties, began to lose discipline. They broke into houses, looting and setting fires, which only enraged the colonists more. By the time the battered column reached Lexington, they were on the verge of collapse. They were saved only by the arrival of a relief force of 1,000 men and 2 cannons. But even with reinforcements, the ordeal wasn't over. The fighting continued all the way to the outskirts of Boston. By the end of the day, nearly 4,000 colonists were harrying the British column until the soldiers finally found protection under the Royal Navy's guns in the harbor. The day had started with a secret mission to stop a rebellion, and it ended in a bloody, humiliating retreat. The British suffered 73 killed, 174 wounded, and 26 missing. The Americans had 49 killed and 39 wounded. The numbers might seem small by modern standards, but the message was enormous. The American militia had engaged one of the world's best armies and driven them from the field. The siege of Boston. In the aftermath, the British were in shock. General Gage's plan to intimidate the colonists had backfired in the worst way possible. Instead of crushing a rebellion, he had started a war. His battered forces were now trapped in Boston. On the landward side, they were now besieged. The thousands of militiamen who answered the alarm didn't just go home. They stayed. Within days, a sprawling makeshift army of nearly 15,000 men from all over New England had formed a ring around Boston, pinning the British army inside. The skirmishes of April 19th had turned into a full-blown military siege. News of Lexington and Concord spread like lightning through the 13 colonies, rallying support for the Patriot cause. What started as a Massachusetts problem was now an American one. The bloodshed had turned political debate into armed conflict. There was no turning back. The Second Continental Congress would soon meet and, in a critical move, adopt the militia army as their own, creating the Continental Army and appointing George Washington as its commander. The day had proven 2 things. First, it showed the British that the American colonists weren't just a rabble. They were organized, determined, and willing to die for their liberty. Second, and maybe more importantly, it proved to the colonists themselves that they could stand up to the might of the British military. A line had been crossed. The die was cast. The skirmish on a village green had erupted into a revolution that would change the course of history. The events of April 19, 1775, are a powerful reminder that ordinary people, united by a belief in liberty, can stand up to extraordinary power. The mystery of who fired the first shot at Lexington remains, but in a way, it doesn't matter. That shot was inevitable, the physical release of a decade of political conflict. From the tense standoff at Lexington to the defiant volley at Concord and the brutal retreat to Boston, that single day proved the colonists' unbreakable resolve. It was the spark that ignited the American Revolution, an 8-year struggle that would give birth to a new nation. The phrase, "the shot heard round the world," written by Emerson decades later, perfectly captures that significance. It symbolized a turning point, not just for America, but for the world, announcing a new era where the ideals of freedom and self-governance would be fought for and won. If you found this piece of history as fascinating as we do, please give this video a like and share it with someone who might enjoy it. And be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into the moments that shaped our world. Thanks for watching.